On the worst morning of the 1989 drought, four stock trucks rolled into Lyle Mercer's yard before sunrise. One of them belonged to the man who had spent 14 years calling Lyle's windmill a toy. That alone would have been enough to make a farmer stop what he was doing. But the real shock was what sat behind those trucks: empty tanks, dust on the fenders, and nearly 300 head of cattle waiting on a well that only made 12 gallons a minute. Lyle was standing at the tower with a wrench in one hand, tightening the packing nut while the windmill clicked above him in the dark. He watched the headlights come down the lane, he watched the first truck stop, he watched Wade Purcell step out with his cap already in his hands. And if you want to understand why that mattered, you have to go back to the spring of 1975. Back to a meeting in the Dighton American Legion Hall, when the future came to western Kansas in a stack of loan forms and a smile. The man carrying that future was named Martin Keene. He worked for the USDA Development Office in Garden City. He was 38, tan from the road, fresh off a promotion, and absolutely certain he was bringing prosperity to every county he entered. For 6 weeks, he had driven the same route across the high plains, with the same slide deck in his trunk and the same promise in his mouth. Bigger pumps, deep turbine wells, center pivots, high-yield irrigated corn, and enough underground water to make the old dryland way look like stubborn poverty. That Tuesday night, 43 farmers sat in metal folding chairs while Martin made his pitch. He talked about the High Plains Aquifer as if it were a savings account too large to notice. He talked about subsidized drilling, favorable loan terms, cheap power, and the kind of yields that could turn a dusty wheat county into a sea of green circles. Dryland wheat, he said, might give you 25 bushels in an ordinary year. Irrigated corn could give you 150. The numbers were not subtle. That was the point. By the time Martin finished, most of the room had already decided. Men stood up, moved toward the table, and started writing their names. Lyle Mercer stayed in the back. He was 46 then. Dryland wheat, grain sorghum, and 70 head of cattle on short grass pasture. No degree, no office, no appetite for debt, just 320 acres, a weathered face, and the habit of listening all the way to the end before deciding whether a thing was useful. Martin noticed him in the parking lot. "Mr. Mercer," he said, catching up under the yellow lot light. "You didn't take a packet. Anything I can clear up?" Lyle was leaning against a faded green pickup with a cracked mirror and feed dust on the tailgate. Martin for a long moment, then asked a question no one else in that hall had bothered to ask. "How fast does the deep water refill under this county?" Martin blinked. "The average natural recharge is a little under an inch a year. But that's not really the relevant measure because the total saturated thickness. And how much does a full pivot use in a season? Depending on crop and weather, somewhere around 22 inches. Lyle nodded once. "So you pull 22 out," he said, "and nature puts back less than 1. Martin started to answer, but Lyle was already done. "That's not farming," he said. "That's liquidation with crops growing on top of it." Martin gave the kind of smile men give when they think patience will rescue the conversation. "The reserves are enormous." "Maybe," Lyle said, "but I'm not farming the word enormous. I'm farming this county." Then he got in his truck and drove home. The next Monday, he walked the 47 acres at the bottom of his west draw with a tile probe and a notebook. He had been watching that ground for 9 years. It was the piece no one bragged about. Too low in wet springs. Too sticky under equipment. Too green in August to behave like the rest of the farm. He had tried cropping it 3 times and lost money every time. But after he quit fighting it, he noticed something. In dry summers, when the upland sorghum curled and the pasture went gray, the draw stayed alive. Blue stem held color longer there. The sedges stayed soft underfoot. The soil gave under a boot in places the rest of the farm had already turned hard. He had seen that pattern enough times to know it was not luck. So he walked it in 20-foot lines with the probe. At the higher edge, the rod met dry resistance. At the center swale, the feel changed. Below 2 feet, the soil loosened. Below 3, the tip came up with damp coarse sand stuck to it. That afternoon he drove to the county office and asked for the old geological overlays. Nobody ever requested unless a septic system had failed. The maps showed a buried terrace gravel seam crossing the lower edge of his place at roughly 35 to 45 feet. Not the deep aquifer. Not the big water everyone was racing toward. A shallow local body of sand and gravel. Small, limited, but fed by snowmelt, thunderstorm runoff, and every hard rain that dropped into the draw and filtered down through the root channels. Lyle called a driller in Scott City. "I don't want the deep water," he said. "I want the gravel shelf above it." There was silence on the other end. "Most men are asking for 700 gallons a minute now," the driller said. "I need 12, Lyle said. 12 that still exists next year." The well came in at 41 feet. 12 gallons a minute. Clear. Cold. Steady. A rusted air motor windmill from an abandoned place north of town rebuilt the sucker rod, replaced the leathers, and had the whole thing turning by early June. Total cost, $510. By harvest, some of his neighbors were already carrying $40,000 irrigation notes. The jokes arrived faster than the rain. Wade Purcell delivered most of them. Wade owned the dealership outside town. Combines, tractors, pump parts, pivot components. A wide man with a salesman's lungs and the habit of speaking like the whole county had asked for his opinion at once. At the co-op counter he announced that Lyle Mercer had spent the summer building the most expensive bird perch in Lane County. 12 gallons a minute, Wade said, loud enough for the men by the seed rack to hear. "That's not a farm well. That's a nervous garden hose." Everybody laughed. Lyle heard every version of it. He kept rebuilding fence, kept planting wheat, kept grazing the draw, kept the windmill turning. Then came the boom years. From 1976 through 1980, the county looked like the sales brochure had learned how to breathe. Green circles spread across the plains. Corn stood where dryland men had never expected to see corn. Land prices climbed. New grain bins went up. The dealership lot turned over faster than Wade could stock it. Men who had never liked debt decided debt looked different when the pivot was running. Lyle's place did not change much. Dryland wheat, dryland sorghum, 70 head. Used machinery, paid in cash when he could. A small well filling a stock tank under a windmill everyone still thought was a joke. People did not see a strategy when they looked at Lyle. They saw an old idea. A man refusing the future. Someone too cautious to capitalize on the moment. Wade said as much. "He's leaving money in the dirt," he told anyone willing to listen. "Everybody else is getting paid by the acre. Mercer's over there worshiping a patch of grass." The patch of grass was exactly what Lyle was protecting. In 1977 he posted a hand-painted board at the edge of the draw. "Recharge Meadow. No tillage. No wheels." The letters were ugly. The meaning was not. Lyle had figured out what that ground was doing. The blue stem roots ran deep. The soil there stayed open. Rain hit that draw, slowed, soaked, and slipped downward instead of tearing off in a sheet. The meadow was not wasted land. It was the intake. The gravel seam below was the storage. The well was only the outlet. If he disked that draw, cropped it, packed it with tires, or shaved it bare in a dry season, the water would still come for a while. Then less of it would. Then one day the well would look just like everybody else's assumptions. Temporary. So he left the meadow alone. In 1978 the first district water level bulletin arrived in the mail. It was the kind of document most men dropped on a counter and forgot under seed invoices. Lyle read every page at the kitchen table. The numbers were plain. Since the new wave of pumping began, static water levels under the heaviest irrigated sections had already started slipping. Not dramatic yet, just enough to be ignored. Lyle got graph paper from the drawer. He drew the first line in pencil. Year, average decline. He updated it every time a new bulletin came. By 1981, the line was no longer a curiosity. A few wells needed pump adjustments. A few pivots lost pressure on the outer spans. Men called drillers quietly, paid the service bill, and told nobody. Lyle carried one of the district reports to a public board meeting and asked a question no one wanted attached to their name. If the pumping stays above refill, he said, what is the county planning to do when the easy lift is gone? The chairman thanked him for the comment and moved on. Afterward, Wade caught him in the gravel lot and laughed without much meanness in it, which almost made it worse. Lyle, he said, the water's still there. The corn's still green. You've been waiting years to be right about this. Lyle folded the report under his arm. I'm not waiting to be right, he said. I'm waiting to see whether the math changes. It didn't. The summer of 1984 was the first time the county felt the answer in its bones. Rain shut off. Pivots ran longer. Power bills rose. A few more wells lost pressure during grain fill. The county talked about heat, wind, bad luck, electric rates, anything except the thing happening below their feet. Then came 1989. If the earlier dry years had been warnings, 1989 was the collection notice. By June the topsoil was powder. By July the pasture looked singed. Stock ponds shrank into black rims and then disappeared. Creeks turned to strings of mud. The irrigated fields kept their color only by asking the deep wells for more than those wells had ever been forced to give at once. The pivots ran through the night. The motors hummed. The nozzles stitched water into the dark. And the pressure began to fall. At first it looked mechanical. A relay. A pump issue. A clogged line. Then too many farms started saying the same thing. The far end of the span wasn't throwing like it used to. The rotation slowed. The pump sucked air on restart. The intake had to be lowered. Then lowered again. Then some wells simply stopped being worth the fight. The crop losses were bad. The cattle problem was worse. A field can fail quietly. A thirsty herd cannot. By the second week of August, men were hauling water in tanks from town systems, from surviving domestic wells, from wherever they could buy an hour of relief. It was expensive, humiliating, and nowhere near enough. That was when the trucks came to Lyle Mercer's place before sunrise. Glenn Haskell in the first truck, Tom Arnett behind him, a flatbed with a nurse tank strapped to it in third, and Wade Purcell in the last pickup, dusk gray and not looking at anybody. Lyle set the wrench on the tower leg and let the silence sit until someone chose to break it. Glenn did. We need water, he said. Lyle looked at the tanks. How many head? About 280. Lyle glanced at the stock tank, the pump rod, the turning wheel overhead. This well makes 12 gallons a minute, he said. Not 700. You want it, we run it on a clock. 2 hours each. Every day. No fighting in the yard. We'll take anything, Tom said. Wade still had not spoken. Lyle turned to him last. Wade held his cap with both hands, fingers working the brim. My south well quit 3 days ago, he said quietly. The north one's barely giving enough for the house. I've got 83 head standing around dust. Lyle looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped over to the valve and opened the line to the nurse tank. Back the first trailer up, he said. It took 50 minutes to fill 600 gallons at 12 gallons a minute. No one complained. Not that morning. Not any morning after. For 5 straight weeks, the line formed at Lyle's place at dawn. Men who had once measured worth by horsepower and well depth now stood under a windmill they used to laugh at and waited their turn like patients outside a country clinic. Lyle never charged them. When Glenn tried to hand him cash, Lyle pushed it back. "I'm not selling the rain," he said. "I'm just moving it from one place to another." The county finally started asking the right question. Why was his well still working? The answer was not romance. Not luck. Not some mystical affection between an old farmer and old machinery. It was design. Or, more precisely, restraint. Lyle's water was not tied to the deep reserve that everybody had turned into a race. It came from a shallow gravel seam recharged by local weather and protected by the one decision everyone had mocked. He had left the meadow alone. Those 47 acres were the reason the well survived. The roots kept the ground open. The draw slowed runoff. The storms that did come still had somewhere to go besides sideways. What fell there moved down. What moved down reached the gravel. What reached the gravel showed up at the well. His source was smaller. That was exactly why it could be protected. One morning in the 4th week, Wade arrived early while the others were still on the road. The sunrise had just started catching the dry tops of the bluestem. The windmill threw a long shadow over the meadow. Lyle was checking the rod guides when Wade walked over and stopped beside the fence. "How did you know?" Wade asked. Lyle did not look up right away. "I didn't know the exact year things would tighten," he said. "I knew the county was building around water that left faster than it came back." Wade stared at the meadow. "And this? This is different," Lyle said. "The deep water is old savings. Men love savings when they act like income. This is more like a paycheck. Smaller, regular, only works if you stop spending it before it's gone." Wade let that sit. "I said some things about you," he said finally. "You did. I told people you were scared of progress." Lyle tightened the fitting and wiped his hand on a rag. "No," he said. "You told people what the boom looked like from your side of the counter." Wade nodded once. Then, he said the hardest sentence a man like him could say without flinching. "I was wrong." Lyle opened the valve to Wade's tank. "The cattle are thirsty," he said. "Let's solve that first." When the drought finally broke in October, the county did not return to normal. Too much had been seen. Men who had spent a decade trusting capacity alone had now watched capacity fail in public. They had watched small, replenished water outperform big, declining water for the one job that mattered most in a crisis: keeping living things alive. That fall, a groundwater district hydrologist named Helen Sutter drove out to Lyle's place with survey sheets, aerial maps, and more curiosity than pride. She walked the meadow, measured the draw, checked the depth logs, studied the gravel notes, stood at the wellhead while Lyle explained what he had been watching since the late 60s. Then she asked the question no official had asked him before. "How many places in this county do you think are shaped like this?" They spent the afternoon with topographic maps spread across his kitchen table. By sunset they had marked 9 likely properties: draw bottoms, low convergences, old terrace edges, land most men described as troublesome because it did not behave like the rest of the field. Helen published a district bulletin the next spring. Not a miracle story. Not a tribute piece. A practical paper. Shallow terrace gravel development as livestock drought insurance. Site indicators. Recharge protection. Traffic exclusion. Expected yields. What such wells could do. What they could not do. 5 landowners followed it closely enough to drill. 4 hit viable water. 1 missed and re-drilled 30 yards over. By the mid-90s, several ranches that would have hauled water in every dry spell now had shallow backup wells of their own. Lyle never called it a movement. Never called it innovation. If anyone praised him too directly, he shrugged and said he had simply quit trying to make the wrong ground do the wrong job. He farmed until 2004. By then his son Aaron had taken over most of the machinery work, but the meadow was still untouched except for grazing rotation and fence repair. The original sign had long since rotted away. Aaron replaced it with a cedar post and a clean metal plate. Recharge Meadow. Protected since 1975. The well is still there. Into the late 90s before Lyle replaced it with a submersible pump. Because age had started collecting its share from his shoulders. But the hole is the same. The gravel is the same. The water is the same kind of water it always was. Not glamorous. Not huge. Not built for bragging. Just present. District records now show the deep levels under the heaviest pumped parts of the county have fallen far enough that several original pivot systems run below their old design capacity. A few have been abandoned. Some still operate, but with more cost, more caution, and less certainty than the salesman promised in 1975. Lyle's well still recovers with the wet seasons. Slowly, modestly, reliably. Wade Purcell sold fewer pivots after 1990. He diversified into parts, hay equipment, stock systems, and finally retired with less swagger and more patience than he had in his 40s. Before he left the dealership for good, he had his own draw tested and drilled a shallow backup well above a gravel lens on the north side of his pasture. It never made much more than 10 gallons a minute. He called it the smartest small well he had ever seen. There is a framed sheet of graph paper in Aaron Mercer's office now. The pencil line starts in 1978 and keeps falling year after year. Below it hangs a second chart Aaron continued after Lyle stopped writing. That line falls too. The deep water still tells the same story. So does the Meadow. One line tracks what a county took. The other marks what one man protected. That is why the trucks were in Lyle Mercer's yard before sunrise in 1989. Not because he had more water than everyone else. Because he had built his farm around the only water he could reasonably expect to see again. The boom years had a louder argument. The drought had the final one. And on the plains, where every promise eventually has to pass through weather, the most valuable ground is not always the ground that yields the most. Sometimes it is the ground you leave alone long enough to keep the rest alive.